Greetings, scholars of global Christian theology. This is Dr. Zbarshek here. I'm here to record this video to talk to you a little bit more about Chapter 3 of Religion and Faith in Africa, Confessions of an Animist. Chapter 3 is entitled A Marketplace of Faiths. And in this chapter, what Father Orobator would like to do is, on the one hand, talk about the kind of competition which comes about in Africa between and amongst a variety of traditions, not just Christianity and Islam, but many of the branches of the various Christian churches. So there's the colonial churches, right? The various kinds of Protestant churches that came over with the Europeans. Lutherans in Namibia, for example, if any of you study away in Namibia, one of the reasons that PLU has a program in Namibia is because Namibia was colonized by Germans, and specifically by German Lutherans. So there is a kind of Lutheran connection that PLU has with the majority Lutheran population there. Additionally, somebody like Father Orobator being Roman Catholic as well. It's kind of one of the colonial churches, as well as Methodists, Anglicans, right? The Church of England, Methodists, and others, Baptists as well, right? Additionally, there's a variety of what we call African independent churches, which are independent, have come about in the post-colonial period and have a variety of mix and match kinds of factors, Pentecostalism, and other groups as well. And then, of course, within Islam, there's Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and the variety of mix and match between various forms of Islam and other forms of African traditional religion. What some theorists have liked to say is that there's kind of a so-called marketplace where people sort of pick and choose in that way. As I said, I think what Father Orobator would like to do is kind of subvert that notion, because the idea of a marketplace means you pick one and not the other, right? Whereas what Father Orobator would like to say is, no. There's a variety of things that go into this kind of African religious kind of thing, but all of which come from this marketplace but make up their own kind of thing. Another book of his, which I've often taught, is called Theology Brewed in an African Pot, where he does talk about African theological life as a kind of like stew, right? Where there's a variety of mixtures which all come together, some coming from Europe, some coming from Africa, and it makes something entirely new. And I think like that is the kind of thing which he is kind of pointing himself toward, right? So it is not one, I'm buying this and not that. It's I'm getting a bunch of different things from a bunch of different things and making something new which comes out of it. That's the idea behind the marketplace. In chapter 3, Orobator lays out more clearly what he thinks of what African traditional religion is. That's one of your reading questions. It's on page 55. There's a little bullet list there. For your answer, you can also have a bullet list. That's fine. But what he says, and I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about it quickly to make sure I get it exactly right, is he says that the African religion has these characteristics, more or less, right? Himself and a number of other scholars want to say that, right? He says first there's a two-tier structure of belief that recognizes a supreme or ultimate deity, or being, and with a bunch of lesser auxiliary economic gods or goddesses or agents, right? And I think, like, in that sense, it isn't any wonder, right, that he became a Roman Catholic. There's something quite similar to what a kind of traditional Catholic concept is there's, of course, God, right? And God is, of course, supreme and all those kinds of things. But then there's Mary and the saints, which are there for a variety of kinds of ways of being in the world, right? You might appeal to, say, for example, as a devout Italian Roman Catholic, to St. Anthony when you lose something. You might also appeal to St. Michael when you're going into battle, if you're a soldier or something like that, right? Knowing, of course, that God is supreme, right? But these other kinds of beings are helpful in a variety of ways. I think African religion operates in much the same fashion, right? There's a supreme being, and then there's a series of other kinds of folks. This sort of two-tiered thing is very, very common in a variety of places. Second, he talks about a cosmological worldview that structures levels of existence on a grid of the visible material realm and the invisible spiritual realm, where spiritual beings and human beings interact either to advance or to hinder the well-being of the living. There's my daughter in the background. Hi, Anna. Thanks. On the little photobomb there. And I think that's an important thing to note as well, that there is this kind of like spiritual and physical realm, and they kind of have a connection with one another. That's great. There's additionally, there's a space where through a series of ritual practices, human beings try to collect or channel or orient those energies toward health and well-being, right? There's an ethical framework which prioritizes life and its flourishing. There's a preoccupation, talks about with health, well-being, and wholeness, that accords devotees a multiplicity of means to fortify them. So rituals, amulets, practices, a variety of kinds of things, all oriented toward health, wholeness, and well-being, right? And then finally, he says the use of symbols and art to embody, portray, and transmit values and beliefs. And I think all religions have that as well, and certainly African religion has that. So those are the kinds of things which he is wanting to talk about, speaking out of African religion. Now, how does African religion relate to the other two religions which are in sub-Saharan Africa, which he does point out, right? In the previous chapter, where he says kind of the miracle of the century, Christianity has increased, he says something like 74-fold, depending on his counting, and Islam like 20-fold. There's a tremendous kind of growth in both Islam and Christianity in the 20th century. It's just remarkable in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, the way in which Father Orobator talks about that growth, he does not see it as a matter of replacement. He wants to be very clear that it is not that African religion is declining because Christianity and Islam are growing. He sees that, he says, the way that he talks about it is kind of an architectural metaphor, where he says, look, what's going on is African religion is the foundation. Everybody has this. Everyone has these characteristics. The notion of a multiple spiritual beings. There's a supreme being, and then there's a bunch of other ones which also matter, right? It's oriented toward life. There's a series of ritual practices. You engage in them. That's okay. He says this is the foundation out of which Christianity and Islam build. He says build either their steeples or their minarets, right? Steeples, of course, are the kind of towers on churches where bells were traditionally had and rung, and minarets are in mosques, in Islamic houses of worship, the towers from which there is the call to prayer. So the steeples and the minarets are all built on this foundation of African religion. Now, let's think for a moment quadrilaterally. What does that mean? As we kind of think about the way in which he's theologically putting that together, right? And I think, like, anytime you use a kind of metaphorical analysis, right, you're engaging in an activity of the reason. That's an important kind of thing, right? He's certainly looking at the traditions, right, in a variety of ways. He's looking at Christianity, he's looking at Islam, he's looking at African religion, he's saying, this is what it is, right? But then how does one view it, right? How does one see it? And I think what Orobator is trying to do is to say, look, we have a metaphorical orientation. This is an activity of the reason. I see this kind of, in a certain sense, as a work of art. And I say, if I were to understand it in this fashion, I would say that this is the way in which it is functioning. So, once again, that's chapter 3. There's a lot more material there, but this is kind of a brief introduction to some of the important points, which I do talk about in your reading questions. And also just wanted to kind of lift up, as it were. Let me consult my notes quickly, see if there's anything I've left out. Oh, right. One other thing, right? Again, I think I mentioned this last time, but I'll just mention it again, right? He wants to say, look, he wants to avoid a simplistic understanding, either of, in the first part, sort of condemning African tradition, as so many colonial Europeans did, as dark and evil and of the devil and so on and so forth. He says, no, this is our way of life. This is our culture. This is great, right? This is an important way of being in the world. It's not your way of being in the world, but it is ours, right? And additionally, but at the same time, not wanting to either say Christianity is all good or all bad either, right? We're going to look a little bit this more clearly in chapter 4, where he talks about pathological performance and prophetic practice. And that's an important kind of thing. But he wants to say, no. There's also terrible things within both Christianity and Islam. this kind of like orientation, which is easily spills over into violence, and he has terrible sorts of examples. I mean, just a couple of them are the Lord's Resistance Army on the Christian side, right, and Boko Haram on the Muslim side, and says, no, these are people who take the kind of religious impulse and use it in bad ways, right? So, I mean, I think that's another important thing to note, is that he is not kind of like, I think, simplistic in any kind of fashion to kind of offer, oh, well, African traditional religion is all good. No, not necessarily, right? Christianity and Islam are all great. No, not necessarily, right? There are parts which are good and bad in both, right? One of my favorite theorists of religion at one point said, all the great world traditions are mixtures of great good and frightening evil. And I think like that's just absolutely the case. I think that's just an empirical thing that one can say while looking at these traditions. So again, great good, frightening evil, and Father Orobator is very kind of, I guess, clear-eyed about what's going on. So once again, hope that this is helpful to you, and we will chat more about Chapter 4 later.